Good morning, everyone. I'm Christina Stabe. I am the Global Finance Impact Lead at the Global CCS Institute. And so, as we heard this morning, there's been a tremendous push around the world for CCS deployment, supported by enabling policies and investments. So going forward, countries, companies, the finance sector, and other stakeholders will need to collaborate to de-risk, fund, and deploy these projects and the associated infrastructure. So today we're going to hear perspectives from our panelists, including government and private capital, about how policy and funding are supporting deployment. We'll also hear a status update from the UK and the Netherlands, and we'll hear about what supports project bankability. So we're going to turn to the planned discussion. We'll do our best to save some time at the end for questions. So good morning, panelists. Thank you for joining me. Let me just introduce each of our panelists first before we get started. So right next to me here, I have Pim van Loon, who is the Program Manager, Carbon Capture and Storage at the Ministry of Climate Policy and Green Growth for the Netherlands. And we have Dr. Michael Brown, Head of Funding and Strategy, Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, Government of the United Kingdom. We have Urbano Troncoso, Executive Director, Structured Finance at Santander, and Andrew Lee, Managing Director at Societe Generale in London. Wonderful. All right, so let's kick off our discussion. Michael, let me start with you. So financial close was reached for the UK's East Coast cluster at Teesside in December of 24. And multiple banks also announced their participation in the financing for the Northern Endurance Partnership, or NEP, and Net Zero Teesside Power, or NZT Power projects. And we know the UK government's undertaken significant work to develop the approach and business models to support bringing that cluster together. So can you start us off by briefly touching on the scope of the East Coast cluster? And at a high level, can you share how the supportive business models that you developed help bring project financing to the table?
Sure. Am I audible?
Just start talking, let's see if it works.
Great.
Yeah.
So in the UK, I think like in most other countries, a lot of our industrial emissions are focused on coastal regions, in particular in England in the northeast, northwest. So recognising this, the UK CCS programme has developed this concept of shared use transport and storage networks in those key industrial clusters that then connect into individual projects developing a network. The idea being that you can then expand from initial projects into more stores, more clusters, with demand increasing, hopefully then justifying a growth direction. At the start of the decade, we looked at, with the net zero commitment, we had obviously a push for CCS to be delivered in the UK, and we began looking at bids and assessments of the clusters. We came after looking at these to HyNet and the East Coast clusters. HyNet in the northwest and sort of north of Wales, and then ECC in the East Coast cluster of the UK. East Coast cluster, sometimes Teesside, based on the sort of estuary of the Tees River. So structurally, the idea is that there would be the TNS with storage projects in the South North Sea for the East Coast cluster, connecting by an offshore pipeline to Redcar in this case, onshore to a small group of initial capture projects. First group of capture projects are power, industry, and hydrogen. That's kind of scope of how we're thinking about it, and then in terms of the models we've developed. The idea is that we have essentially a modular business model system where we have a transport and storage model that supports pipeline, both onshore and offshore, along with the storage in the actual offshore stores. And then the TNS model is based on fees per tonne of CO2 that are then recouped by fees paid by the capture project. That's underpinned by a set of regulatory framework, the network codes, which talks about the CO2 quality, how additional connections are handled, things like outage handling and so forth. The Capture projects are then individually based on what their sectors are. So we recognize pretty early that because we are looking at a real gamut of the economy in the UK, the different sectors that the emitters are looking at would need probably bespoke business models. So we developed a set of archetypes, we developed power, industry, hydrogen, and we're in the works of developing others. For power, in the UK, we have a lot of renewables, particularly offshore wind, and so dispatchable power is really useful for us to be able to cover the variability in dispatch. And so we have a power model that is akin to the CFD, where the subsidy of government steps in based on the electricity grid position. And then on the industry side, similar, we have a carbon price reference instead of the electricity price. On the hydrogen side, you then have slightly more complex, and you could run an entire panel talking about the hydrogen model, because it has to deal with both the supply side and the demand side. But then the whole thing comes together, that you have the business models for the sectors that integrate both physically and commercially with the TNS models, and hopefully develop something that is investable, which we proved a few months ago.
Mm. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later in the discussion, but thank you for setting the stage with the UK business models. Pim, let me turn to you to just also set the stage for the Netherlands projects. You've got significant ongoing CCS activity and a multi-layered policy and funding approach to supporting deployment. So can you briefly mention the key projects in the Netherlands and also their status, and then touch on your supportive funding and risk management approaches?
Certainly, and thank you for inviting me here. It's great to see such a great interest in CCS. I think we need that going forward. The Netherlands have been developing its legal framework, its policy framework since 2010, with the inclusion of CCS in the SE++ funding scheme in 2018. And I think that has resulted now in, let me touch upon the three most interesting projects we have. Yara/Scale, fertilizer producer, is one of the clients of the Northern Lights project to be started next year with commercial shipping. It has taken its FID. It's an ongoing project. But I think the most interesting example in 2023, November 2023, Portos has taken its FID. This is a project with 4 clients in the harbor of Rotterdam, connected to a TNS system to be where CO2 is stored in the Dutch North Sea. And we are in a far stage of development of the Aramis project, and the Aramis project is let's say, sort of a Portals XL. It has many emitters to be connected, but it also has multiple sources, things to be where the CO2 is delivered, and it has a receiving terminal also for foreign CO2, and that is, I think, the business model there for all 3 of them is we have to synchronize in a synchronized way, develop TNS infrastructure as well as get the emitters committed. And if we look at the funding example of Portos, the main model is the emitters pay a transport and storage fee to the TNS operator, but at the same time, that does not easily cover for the whole thing. So if you look at the Portos example, there's a CEF subsidy for CAPEX, a little under 10% of the CAPEX cost, and all 4 emitters in the Portos project have a subsidy for the unprofitable top to secure them of being able to finance the whole project and de-risk some of that cost so that they can take their investment decision. Aramis project, I'll touch upon that. I think we'll get
save a little
more
bit for
of it.
later.
Yeah, sure.
Because we don't say it all in the beginning, because you'll mess up my order of questions, right? Well, before we get into those specific talks, let me get the bankers to join the conversation. Urbano, let me go to you first. Can you share briefly with us Santander's activities, your views of the CCS space, and are there certain types of projects and regions in which you have more interest?
Sure. No. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. For those of you that don't know it, Santander is, we are one of the largest banks in the Eurozone, and definitely a bank with a pedigree in project finance specifically, I think it's one of the areas where we have excelled over many years, right? So we are first, number one, number two, global MLA, and we have been consistently over there for the last 5+ years, and especially when it comes to energy transition. That probably is the reason why I'm here. So we are the largest financier of renewables in Europe, and the second largest in the world. That means that, okay, every year we do 15 gigas. And you would ask me, why are you mentioning renewables? We are talking about CCS. It's a fair question. But I would say that, okay, more and more we are starting to see some interrelations. And the reason for that is that first, we started working in energy transition 20 years ago, when we started financing the first wind assets, PV assets, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, we have always tried to be at the forefront of the energy transition. That meant that 5 years ago, we realized that electrons were great, but were not the only solution. And there were other options and other elements that were going to be required if we were to achieve the energy transition targets that have been defined, right? So then we started working on things like P2X, things like biofuels, things like carbon capture, right? And more we are seeing that they are interrelated, right? Because at the end of the day, it has been mentioned today, it's not only about carbon capture and storage, it's also about carbon capture and utilization, right? So I think that there we are seeing clear synergies with the P2X world. We are seeing how biofuels more and more are trying to find some alternative sources of revenues, right, that can be derived from potentially, the carbon that is stored, and the certificates that they can sell. So just to frame a bit what we are doing. Then in terms of specifically carbon capture, we are the largest financier to the projects that were just mentioned. So both NEP and NZT in the UK. And I think that, it's something that definitely shows our commitment with the sector. On top of that, we are currently advising multiple projects, around Europe and the US, and we are credit approved in a couple of transactions. This is only on the debt side, and then also on the equity side, we think that it's relevant to work on this area. So we recently supported, for example, carbon collectors, on a DevEx equity rise. That was also quite important. So at the end, I think that we are trying to support the capital creation, for these first players that are in the space, in order to grow and to enable the projects to happen. In terms of regions, I think that definitely the UK has created a regulatory framework that we will discuss later that set great foundations for non-recourse financing and coming back to the debt. Other regions we are seeing that are taking relevant steps. I think that we have discussed right now what is happening in Netherlands. We will discuss what is happening in Denmark, etc., and also in the US. So I think that is great, especially on the revenue side. I think that what we need potentially, is to see more actions on the risk mitigation space.
We'll talk about risk allocation in a minute. Andrew, same general question to you. Can you tell us about Société Générale and your activities?
Yeah, so I won't get into a fight with Urbano on the relative merits of Société Générale in the energy transition space, but we are a major advisor and lender to projects across the renewable and energy transition sectors. My role, actually, I work across our teams worldwide, so I get to see project activity in Europe, in the US, in Asia. And we, along with other banks, have an interest. We have capital to deploy, but we see the challenges. None of the projects in the energy transition space are really fundamentally economic without support. So in the UK, on NZT NEP, where we were the sole financial advisor to both projects, the government support was critical to getting those projects banked. But of course, the government will only support projects that are viable, that understand what is needed from government, and can present the right risk allocation. So we worked with NZT NEP right from the start. We started off doing bankability studies with them and advising them. We'll come to this later, but advising them on the contracting strategy, the risk allocation, how they could get to a point where they could present to the UK government a project with a degree of certainty, or at least calibrated uncertainty, such that the government could reasonably come to a conclusion as to the support that was needed, but also calibrate that support to be good value to the UK taxpayer. And across the world, we see similar challenges with different solutions. So we financed, one of the banks financing a large project in the US, again towards the end of last year, which was carbon capture on 12 existing bioethanol plants. And that the support mechanism there is via the US 45Q tax credits, sequestration wells in Wyoming, but again, a structure that was bankable because of the various elements and how they fit together. Wyoming being one of the 3 states in the US that has state primacy over Class 6 well approvals, meaning that the project had greater control, did not need federal support. That's detail. So we are keen and we are active in all areas of the energy transition, particularly in CCUS and how that links into e-fuels. But as I say, the support mechanisms are required and they are varied depending on jurisdictions. We advise projects in the Nordics, which have a completely different regime based on direct subsidies. The UK is very much on the business models and the support regimes within those business models. The Netherlands is somewhere similar to the UK. But the message, I think, is that the banks have capital to deploy. They are interested in the sector. They want to lead the sector. Banks like SG certainly do, and Santander, I understand, does. So if projects are properly structured and have rationale within the framework of the support mechanisms available, they can be financed and they can be built. Just to caveat that, what we're seeing is, and we'll come on to risk allocation shortly, because of the risk aversion of a lot of the supply chain and the contractors involved, we are seeing, apart from the large projects with large corporate sponsors, BP and Equinor for NZT NEP, for instance, ENI for the HyNet sequestration, we are seeing actually the more bankable projects are tending towards the smaller size. And that's because at the smaller scale, so we're talking hundreds of millions rather than billions, the supply chain is more likely to take its share of the risk needed for projects to be bankable. At the billion-dollar scale, the supply chains are really reluctant to take the required degree of risk. But I think we'll come on to
Yeah, let's come back to that. We do have a whole module on risk allocation, but that was a great preview of it. No worries. But I wanted to go back to Michael because before we get to risk allocation, I think one of the things about the UK business models that we wanted to talk more about was the benefits of the approach of joining up the whole CCUS value chain, capture, transportation, and storage for the East Coast cluster, and how that helped to get those projects financed.
Sure. So I guess I should preface that mileage will vary on this. Obviously, Netherlands, Norway have gone different routes, and the UK's approach is based on, frankly, the learnings we made from the counterfactual. During the 2010s, we did a 2012 and 2015 competitions where we tried to run full chain models, running the gamut from the capture, transport, all the way to the storage in a single integrated project. Obviously, there's very few companies who have the money, the expertise, the interest of doing that on that full whole scale. And so we wound up seeing sort of consortiums trying to do this. And that immediately led to problems of risk. The TNS owners or the storage owners were not trusting that the capture projects would get to operation and vice versa, or that there would be risks around outages or around quality of CO2. And so it became clear that the government was going to have to step in and start being a bit of a broker and a backer for certain of those risks to try and mitigate and make sure we actually progressed. Because the evidence so far is that without any level of subsidy, CCS just doesn't happen without any level of risk coverage, CCS doesn't progress. And so our approach of having this modular system where we have capture projects and the TNS under different models but integrated, we think that provides benefits, certainly in our situation, where you can add new capture projects with relative ease, hopefully, as we get to that. We can expand the storage, relatively naturally based on what the regulatory framework we're defining is. The idea is that a new company could come to us and say, we'd like to join into a TNS system, and it'll be as simple as plugging in a new telephone line. We're obviously not there yet, and that may take some time, but that would then protect them from the risks, the concerns, the expertise of having to understand the whole TNS system, all the financial dynamics of it. That's kind of our theory. Now, early on, we looked at potentially supporting one side of this, where you said, okay, maybe you have a transport and storage model where you heavily subsidize that and hope that the capture comes. Or similarly, you could do vice versa and say, we're going to set up capture projects and hope that the TNS is able to, transport and storage is able to connect in. But without coverage on both sides, when we spoke to industry partners, they were clear that there was not the level of confidence required. And so we've had to provide quite a lot of risk provisions, particularly on whether both sides reach operation around outages, defaults, and so forth. Now, our central theory is that this is purely bootstrapping. We hopefully bring both sides to operation, prove that it works, and hopefully one day, sooner rather than later, the UK government gets to step away and the market runs it on its own merits based on ETS, CBAMs, things we talked about earlier. I think that while I'm not going to pretend that the solution we've got to is totally ideal or optimal, we're going to continue developing it, but the fact that we got to sort of that £21 billion commitment last year proves that at least in our circumstance, this works.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there can be benefits to joining up the CCS value chain and bringing it to market all at once, but that's not always an option. So Tim, I wanted to just turn to you and ask, how is that same issue being approached with the projects in the Netherlands?
Okay, thank you. And also building on what Michael's saying, I think a synchronized development of all parts of the CCS chain is key. And there's different ways to get there, and the UK has its own example. What we have done in the Portos project, and which is also the model for the Aramis project, is to get the CCS chain together, see from the role of the government also what we can do, but keep in mind that synchronized development, a synchronized FID, and also a synchronized decision steps before FID is crucial. And one example that we have built into our system is in the SDE++, which is a subsidy pledge, which has a time span of 6 years, so it can be pledged before FID. It requires a transport declaration, it requires a storage declaration, and it's given to the emitter. So the transport and storage is committed to the emitter in a way. So that's connecting the chain. And the emitter stays committed as it is required to provide a bank guarantee of X percentage of the subsidy pledge. So it keeps the emitter aboard, which gives the TNS development sort of the trust to start building on their new phase. And so you keep, in a synchronized manner, takes these steps towards FID. As I said before, I think, Aramis is Portos XL. Mm-hmm. So if you do Portos with 4 clients, one consortium doing TNS, Aramis does the same model, but things get a bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. So the basis model is still there. There's domestic clients interested in using the TNS infrastructure from Aramis, but Aramis is building a bigger infrastructure with overcapacity, and I think that results also in a bit of need for de-risking to get to a bigger infrastructure where the client potential is also abroad, where we don't have all the policy instruments. And I think for other European countries, supporting emitters so that emitters can contract TNS is crucial in also developing RMS. But we're also looking at, we are currently in talks with the TNS operator in, can we bridge that gap? Can we de-risk the part where you are building a bigger infrastructure than for your first set of clients? So everything, keeping in mind, synchronizing the steps within the building the CCS chain is key.
So, and you mentioned just the complexity that comes in when you're trying to put together an even longer value chain. I just want to ask, do any of the other panelists have comment on that or any views on putting together the longer value chains?
Finance perspective, I think that's something that has, and it has been mentioned, Andrew, Michael, and also by Pim, at the end of the day, what you have to consider is that in many cases, this is not one single project. Those are several projects. And the problem when you start having several projects is that, of course, the more people you bring to the table, the harder it is to agree on the risk allocation that Andrew was mentioning before, right? And the reality is that if you have two banks sitting here at the table, is because I understand that many people want to raise debt, and this is not only about public funding, right? So, and raising debt at project level is the famous project finance, and project finance is about predictability of future cash flows. So that means that anything that is a risk that threatens this predictability is a major problem. So what we are seeing in projects is when you start bringing a lot of people to the table, at some time, it's really hard to agree on these rules of the game in a private agreement. So that is where the role of governments, at the end, I think is going to be critical in these first steps in order to have this risk allocation properly made and enable project finance to come to the table.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the issue with NZT and EP is that the two projects have quite different inherent risks. So we, right from the start with the project, the target was that the requirement was that the projects had to progress together, had to reach financial close together. One project cannot work without the other. But they have different business models, they have different risk profiles, and actually a lot of the work was done with the UK government in really gaining a common understanding of the different risks and what was required of government for the two projects. Because the risk is different for the sequestration. There it's about underwriting things like potential leakage risk or unavailability or fail to complete of emitter projects. On the emitter projects, it's the risk around failure to complete the sequestration project or problems with sequestration. And the government UK government has basically is providing the link between the projects. But the simultaneous development was really critical and really difficult because the two projects had different, shall we say, natural development timelines. Building a power plant is quite different than drilling offshore wells, building offshore infrastructure, permitting and building pipelines. So I think that's the skill of the project and also the strength of the relationship that the project built with the UK government so that there was this common understanding so that both sides of that discussion could really get what they needed, the government supporting the project, generating the development, but also getting value for the UK taxpayer, while the project got the kind of underwriting that it needed, bearing in mind that the project still has to take a large degree of the risk. The actual development risk still largely sits with the project. It's these peripheral risks, effectively, that the government is underwriting.
So you guys are already kind of touching on this, but I think we can finally get to the question about risks very specifically for both Urbano and Andrew. What are the features that help improve project bankability around risk, and how do you like to see risks allocated in order for you to bring your project finance to the table? Obama, maybe I can start with you.
Sure. I think that, well, Andrew was mentioning this right now, right? At the end of the day, you have to understand that you have two projects, or you have several projects that are in two buckets. You get the transport and storage, and then you get the emitters, right? When you have the emitters, the problem is that, okay, what they need is certainty on the transport infrastructure being there by the time they will reach COD. Why? Because otherwise, they will not be able to sell whatever product they're producing. If it's hydrogen, the hydrogen will not be low-carbon hydrogen. If it's product power, it will not be low-carbon power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then basically the revenue will be zero, and they will have the risk of losing the contract, the offtake agreement that they would have signed, which basically would turn this project non-bankable. And this is what lenders would not accept. If then you move to the transport and storage, basically what you have is, okay, I need the certainty of the input, right? And unless I have this certainty on the input, I'm building an infrastructure that might not have any utilization, what means that I would not be able to get reimbursed, right? So I think that this is the main challenge we are facing, and this is the reason what we need is, okay, someone getting in the middle. This can be solved, as I mentioned before, earlier, on a private agreement. And actually, for example, we are advising one project, and is reaching financial closing relatively soon in the US, where this is working. Why is it working? Because the emitters are already there. They don't need to build any carbon capture. Those are industrial off-takers that already have streams of highly pure CO2 that can directly be dedicated to or put into this transport and storage infrastructure. So then you're sure that the demand is there. The only thing you need to build is the transport and storage, right? So I think that this is the main point. And then, of course, you have all the elements that then will come linked to this interrelation during the operational phase, right? Because what happens if you have an outage in the transport and storage infrastructure? What happens if there is a leakage that was mentioned before? Those are risks that lenders today are not keen to accept, but it's not only lenders, I would say that even the sponsors cannot accept this type of risks, So I think that definitely what we need is to get this type of support in order to have these risk mitigations that enable the first infrastructure to be deployed. Once this infrastructure will be in place, I think that then having additional interconnections between infrastructure or having more emitters connected to those, is something that can be achieved. But definitely I think that in the first steps, these risk mitigations factors, around this align FID operational risks, and the final life of the asset, is something that definitely is going to be quite critical.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, but that's really just the overall framework that makes a project potentially financeable. Because once you have the government support in place, and projects going forward will be able to take what has been developed and know what is on the table, what is the regime that they can rely on. But the projects still have to be built. The projects have to be built within the same cost and schedule and performance certainty as any other project. The government support mechanisms will not underwrite those risks. I mean, they will, the UK government is underwriting some cost overrun risk, but it's limited. The project still has to take the risk on cost, schedule, and performance. And that is difficult because these are new technologies, or at least technologies in new deployments. They're at different scales, they're in different combinations, and we are faced with a very risk-averse contracting and supply chain market. So, for instance, if you take NZT, if you'd have built a gas-fired power plant 10, 15 years ago, you would have got a contractor to build that on a full lump sum turnkey basis with performance guarantees. Nobody in the UK or Europe, or even actually in the US and Middle East, is prepared to build billion-dollar projects on a conventional EPC basis. Certainly no contractors that we're coming across will take full construction risk. So you're having to devise a less than ideal contracting framework and contract terms with some kind of risk-reward mechanism, certainly around construction cost. So you've got this perception of increased technical risk and a reluctance from the supply chain to take that risk. Now, NZT came up with a bankable solution to that, where the contractors are taking sufficient risk and the contingencies, etc., are sized so that banks are comfortable. But that is a challenge across all the sectors that we're involved in. We advise a much smaller project in the Nordics, and they could not get an EP. This is a synthetic methane project, so carbon capture on a waste-to-energy plant, a combined heat and power plant, green hydrogen produced from wind energy, combined to make methane, liquefied to LNG with an LNG offtake agreement. They could not get a full EPC wrapped contract to build that project. What they have done, they have actually gone for a kind of multi-contract strategy where each of the main technology blocks is supplied as a package on a fixed price, fixed delivery with guarantees on that element. So the carbon capture is supplied by one company who's the licensor, the equipment supplier, and they guarantee the performance of that unit. Similarly for the hydrogen production and similarly for the methanation. So, and that project, we as SG will be a lender to that project. We're hoping that will reach financial close middle of this year. That's an unconventional contracting approach to achieve a bankable risk allocation. And that's what we're seeing will be necessary on other projects. And in fact, on NZT and EP, there are more than 10 large contracts. Some of them are on a fixed price basis, some of them are not. Some of them would never fit into that conventional banking expectation. So nobody's going to drill you wells offshore on a fixed price kind of EPC type project finance basis. Similarly, things like line pipe, you have to be pragmatic on your supply terms. If you want somebody to supply you large quantities of line pipe on a fixed price, you're going to pay a premium. So you have to put together, and this is where we and Santander, if they're an advisor, we work with the projects to try and find a kind of risk allocation, an aggregation of multiple contracts where the risk is taken partly by the supply chain, partly by the contractors, partly by the project, where within that framework, with contingencies appropriately sized, the project makes economic sense within the framework of the support mechanisms that might be available. So that's a big challenge. Without the support mechanisms, projects will not be viable, but then they still have to craft a contracting strategy, a risk allocation that is financeable. And also to get the government support, you have to present something that makes sense. Otherwise, you won't win in the auctions, or your proposals will not be accepted for support.
I think that just a couple of points on what Andrew mentioned, because I think it's quite relevant. I think that, of course, what you mentioned is a project that is going beyond carbon capture, is also integrating hydrogen and going to synthetic fuels. I think that, of course, then we start getting into the famous project-on-project risk, even if it's within the same project, or let's say technology on technology risk, right? Yep. And I think that this is a really relevant point, and I fully agree with you. I think that then we are starting to enter into an area with a complexity from a construction perspective, but not only construction, because I think that there is construction, let's say technical complexity and technological complexity. I think that for me, if you look at the CCS, we are dealing with things that technologically there is some level of innovation, but we are not at the same level with other energy transition, which is positive. So that means that definitely lenders, I think, that are going to be feeling more comfortable, are going to feel more comfortable from a technological perspective, but definitely from a technical perspective, the construction is complex. But of course, if you start adding layers of complexity, then we are talking about something different, right? And I think that something that will be quite critical is the track record of the sponsors, right? So what the sponsors have done before, and proving that, okay, you have a team that can work it out, is something that will be quite relevant. Nevertheless, I think that never consider that this is going to be an easy exercise, because the sum of the parts is not equal to the total, right? It's quite important.
Let me, that's a great discussion on risk, and we have a couple final questions that I think we want to try to squeeze in, but before I turn back to Michael about the UK financing, Pim or Michael, did you have any comments on risk allocation you wanted to share? You don't have to have any, just, we said we'd ask you just in case.
I mean, the dream for us is that in the first instance, the the government is willing and somewhat able to be covering these initial risk allocations, but as the system matures, once you do have those first FIDs, either as an expansion basis or an additional project, additional clusters, you are able to, the market feels more able to take that over in a more direct way, and that the risk is something that can be borne more. Now, hopefully, things like FIDs, things like proof of effectiveness, proof of operation are some of those points that can turn that into something where our risk coverage can diminish over time.
Yeah, maybe to add one point, and Urbana was also pointing at this. There's a bit of a catch-22. Somebody compared this with, the TNS sector is building a hotel, and the emitters are booking hotel rooms in a hotel that's not being built yet. So we have to find ways to overcome this catch-22, and I think it can be done in terms of initial contracts with provisions leading up to more definite contracts with commitments. But we need this kind of thinking about risks, rather than this is a market where you cannot put all your problems on the table and you say, I'm in this part of the chain and I have 100 problems to solve, and only if the other part of the chain solves my 100 problems, I'm going to sign a contract. And then the other side is saying, well, I've got my 57 problems, and I'm not going to sign a contract unless you have solved these. So we need to take in this kind of thinking without losing, basic economics, or without taking unresponsible risks. That's what we need in this sector at the moment.
Collaborative conversation.
Correct.
Yes, okay. I think that was the theme of our GSR, our Global Stats Report, so we had that one right. Let's return to the UK finance package. Michael, I think one thing we wanted to ask you, and you mentioned, the government put forward that 21.7 billion pounds of support, and then project finance came to the table, and it was a really milestone accomplishment in terms of the whole process you went through. But I think what everyone really wants to know is, will that provide precedents for future CCS financings? Or can parts of the approach that we just saw put in place in the UK be used elsewhere?
Yeah, so clearly that's the hope we're trying to seed, that when we do this first iteration of CCS in the UK, that is providing additional confidence so that these guys feel more able to, come on board and take on the second set. Now, I don't think even with the second set that we'll be able to completely divest our sort of risk coverage or our subsidy coverage, and I think that would be naive to think so. But the precedent itself of setting FIDs and proving that it can be done, that there is an investable model, is probably the core precedent from the UK system. I would like to think that some of the modularity that we've developed is fairly useful, or could be useful in certain jurisdictions. The fact that the UK has the net zero commitment across its entire economy means that we're having to look at all of the sort of aspects. Now, something like the 45Qs is an interesting example where, in the majority, as far as I understand it, it really focuses on the lowest part of the MAC curve, because that's where it's most cost effective. We have got a commitment to be covering that entire picture, and so that's why we've got this set of models that can be hopefully decarbonising across a range of sectors.
So we want to save a little bit of time for questions, but I just asked Andrew and Urbano or Pim anything about the UK package that you see could be a precedent going forward. Obviously, you guys that worked on it might have some views.
Well, I can jump in. I think that definitely the concept of understanding that this is not an isolated project is something that I think that can be a precedent, for other jurisdictions when looking at the risk mitigation. And I think that for me this is really important. Is the big difference is that, look, it's not only about funding, and this we have discussed it. It's also about risk mitigation, but risk mitigation not only of this project, but also of the ecosystem. And unless I have the ecosystem, this would not work. Let me give you an example of something that is not CCS, but is something we are advising to. We're advising a project that is a hydrogen project, and basically it relies on a pipeline. The pipeline could be the risk by the project could be the risk by the pipeline, and the off-taker is at the end saying, look, I want the hydrogen. You know which is the problem? The problem is that the pipeline takes 2 years to be built, the project takes 4 years to be built. So the project needs to be built today, so both of them are there at the same time when the pipeline reaches COD. The main challenge is that if this is to happen, then that means that lenders and everyone will have to take FID in a project that relies on an infrastructure that does not exist. Alternatively, what we can do is that we can wait 2 years, both of them take FID at the same time, but then the pipeline will be empty for 2 years. What I mean is that, okay, you have this type of situations because we are trying to build a new infrastructure and a new industry at the same time. And unless we have this ecosystem approach to it, things would not work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, infrastructure is key, and if you take the two halves of the NZT-NEP equation, it's actually the NEP which is the facilitator for the UK carbon capture industry. Now, so that NEP isn't built as a potential white elephant, you need an anchor emitter, NZT. But really the key thing is the infrastructure. So if you consider, and that's why it's under an infrastructure model, if you have a sequestration asset, you can then start to look at decarbonising all sorts of industries, and you can disconnect those developments, as Michael has said. So you need the infrastructure first. And as you say, things like pipelines on hydrogen projects, we're also involved in a hydrogen project that's held because a government-sponsored pipeline has been delayed. It's the infrastructure that government really needs to support directly, if you like. Then, okay, there'll then be other models that incentivize carbon capture itself, whether that be carbon taxes or whether that be subsidies, but that's only possible if you've got the sequestration infrastructure.
Tim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a comment, and it is always a privilege to be in a panel with the UK, and it always provides the opportunity to say, well, we can learn from the UK, but we can also benefit from the UK. And I would like to express my hope that, in the coming years, we can reconnect the UK and the EU either via ETS or with different systems. Because, on a serious note, I mean, the CCS market from the economic side is an international market. Yeah. There's no, it makes economic sense to capture CO2 in mainland Europe and store them in the UK, or vice versa. So I would like to stress that point, and this is, I think, critical also to scaling up the market. So I think we can also learn from the UK, but we can also benefit from integrating UK into the European market again.
That was a great way to draw a line under that discussion. And we have time for a few questions if we have any questions from the audience for these panelists. See one over there.
Rachel Moore, Carbstrat, thanks to the panel for a really insightful discussion. So I'm going to come back on infrastructure because it's one of my favorite topics. Here in the EU, not at this member state level, but at the Commission and EU 27 level, we are predominantly supporting capture rather than the infrastructure. There is some support through the Innovation Fund to transport and storage, but most of it is going to capture, irrespective of what infrastructure is being developed around those capture plants. So how can we take what we've learned from the EU, from the UK model, and bring this over to improve our plans on infrastructure development, which is currently more being developed under the requirement of the NZIA rather than through a government support mechanism?
Anyone?
Well, I would say look at what the UK government has done and what the Netherlands government is doing, and look to develop something similar. And that's obviously a storage site, and the UK is also looking at other areas as well. I mean, we're involved in the Bacton cluster, etc. But look at, you have to find a suitable site and you have to develop the infrastructure to connect to that site. I think I know that sounds simple, but that's the answer.
Yeah.
And I think that the other point at European level, we have to think that not every region has the same storage potential. However, we want to have the same level of capture in most states, right? So I think that there we have to understand that there might be a mismatch, and that, okay, this might not be something that we need to develop at national level, but it might need to be something that is more pan-European, because this might be the only way of being able to have the adequate level of infrastructure and storage that we will need to decarbonize the European industry.
You have a comment?
Yeah, maybe last comment. I think the approach of a synchronized full value chain development is key here. And with the initiatives under the Clean Industrial Deal, I think we have to integrate this kind of thinking in order to develop the full value chains in the European.
Another question? We have a little more time. You guys had your hand up over here first. Yeah.
Hello, Fabienne Moimo from BNP Paribas. We are as well involved in NZT and NEP. So I very much concur to what Andrew and Urbano mentioned, but perhaps a question for you, Michael, and congratulations for developing such an extensive business models. In terms of the various projects that are supposed to mature after INET and after NEP clusters, do you think that the type of support mechanism will remain in place for the future projects?
So I think the theory we have is that this lays the foundations that we're going to evolve from. I think that we would try to be keeping as much of it stable as possible so that we don't have to completely renegotiate things from scratch every time we run this through. Obviously, I don't need to talk about the sort of wider fiscal situation and political situation of the world, and money is tight, particularly public money. And so we would obviously be looking at ways in which we can try and trim it, improve the value for government, and be transferring costs to the private market where they can tolerate it. But yes, I think the principle of it is that we will be using a largely similar model, hoping to build upon that success of making those FIDs and continue to sort of reinforce that we have an investable model that can sequentially, as ETS, as CBAMs, potentially give the market signals that we can turn that into something that's totally market viable longer down the line.
Okay, that was really for Michael, so I don't think the other panelists are going to comment. Another question? I think I saw one in the back. Yeah, over there.
Hi, I'm Rabab. I'm from the International Air Transport Association. Some of the panelists mentioned e-fuels and P2X. As you know, for the aviation sector, there's a mandate for e-fuels in the European Union as well as in the UK. So just wondering, in terms of demand certainty and supply certainty, as well as from a government perspective, to meet these mandates, we also need a big supply of CO2 and potentially CO2 transported over large distances. So in terms of government support, how do you see this playing a role in financing CCS projects further to meet these mandates? Similarly, for private institutions like banks, how do you see this as a sort of risk mitigation measure of sorts in developing these projects?
I can make a very quick comment on that. We advise a number of e-fuels projects, including a very large one in the US, sister projects in Latin America and Australia. And actually the biggest challenge on those projects is not CO2. The biggest challenge is getting long-term offtake at bankable terms. We don't see the CO2 as an issue, and we have the projects we advise, there's various solutions for the CO2. So whether that's biogenic CO2 or, in the US case, bought in pipeline CO2, it's the offtake that's the biggest challenge on ESAF projects.
Yeah.
Michael, did you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe I think that I fully agree with Andrew. I think that we are really active in the P2X space, and the main challenge there is offtake, right? If you want to have a bankable project, you need to have an offtake, and this is what is missing right now. Nevertheless, one comment there, is that, okay, you mentioned carbon capture and e-fuels. I think that there, of course, the Delegated Act, and the differentiation between biogenic CO2 and industrial CO2, so I think that there is a consideration too in there, and it's be careful when you discuss this with your off-taker, because from a banking perspective, I think that, okay, we will look at the offtake, what are you selling, what are you buying is the same, that works, but everyone has to be clear on what happens after 2035 or after 2040.
Michael, you had a comment?
Yeah, this links into one of the questions in the first panel that I thought was quite interesting about whether carbon's an asset or a commodity. And in many ways, having a different mechanism by which you can hopefully turn it into a commodity is really what we would like to see from the market. Even if mandates are the required sort of mechanism to do that, it's a way that you can begin to transfer the sort of funding position from being pure subsidy, pure carbon prices. Now, similarly, referring back to the previous panel, that communications thing needs to be held quite well as well. As you start imposing mandates, whether it's for sustainable aviation fuels or specifically on carbon capture or whatnot, then you need to think about what the public response is and make sure that it's handled properly, and that's largely above my pay grade.
Fair enough. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap it up there, so please join me in thanking our panelists for this great discussion today.